Hey everyone, welcome to the Sensory Parenting Workshop. I'm Julie Nixon and I am thrilled that you are here, eager to learn and willing to grow. Whether you're just wanting to expand your understanding or you're desperate for answers, this workshop is going to be eye-opening, encouraging, and fun. Before we jump in, let me introduce myself to those of you that don't know me. I'm Julie Nixon. I am a homeschooling mom to 3 wild boys, so there is noise and dirt everywhere I look. I officially became a sensory parent 6 years ago when my oldest son, who was 2 at the time, was diagnosed with sensory processing. Like all of you, I became frantic to learn everything I could about sensory processing because my son was just not coping with life. I read books, blogs, I asked doctors and therapists about 12,000 questions, but you see, I had an ace up my sleeve. My mom is an occupational therapist assistant. She's worked for years with kids who have sensory issues. I was so spoiled to have my mom living nearby, seeing our raw daily struggles, and being able to help me see his behavior from a sensory perspective. I've seen firsthand how knowledge and ongoing support can help turn a child's life around, and their moms. My son used to have crippling anxieties and violent meltdowns. Now he's a kid who's learning how to listen to his body, how to get his sensory needs met, and most importantly, that his family is there to support him along the way. He's thriving, and most people have no idea that he has SPD if they don't know what symptoms to look for. I've made it my goal to pass on to you the incredible knowledge and support that I've received. The Sensory Parenting University is opening up next week, and it's designed to help you do both of those things at a deep and in-depth level. There's a video e-course with 21 comprehensive videos to help you understand sensory processing and all the issues that come with it. Plus, there's ongoing support through monthly trainings, a searchable video library of sensory activities, and a thriving community where you can ask your questions. But in this free workshop, we want to get you started on the path towards finding answers and getting some support. All right, let's jump in. Sensory processing is a term that's starting to get a lot of attention. To most of us, it's a little bit foreign. In grade school, we all learned about the 5 different senses. We use our nose to smell, our eyes to see, our skin to touch, our mouth to taste, and our ears to hear. But they left out 3 important senses. We use these 3 senses throughout our day. Vestibular input has to do with sensing movement and balance. The inner ear signals our brain when our body is moving or when our head is inverted. The second sense you might not have heard of is proprioception. Proprioception is the body's ability to sense where it is in space. The body gets that input through the joints and the ligaments when weight is being applied to it. It's something that helps us know what our body is doing without having to visually look at it. The last one is interoception and is related and has to do with the body's ability to sense its internal functions like hunger, thirst, being hot or cold, our energy levels, and whether or not we need to use the bathroom. In the Sensory Parenting University, there's an entire lesson dedicated to each of the different senses, from auditory to vestibular. But for now, just remember that movement and body awareness are also super important senses. Now, our bodies are receiving signals or sensory input from all of the senses all of the time. But we're not always aware of every sensation our body is feeling. We can only give our attention to so much. Maybe you're paying attention to how cold your feet are. Maybe you're delighting in the smell of baking cookies. But perhaps you haven't noticed how uncomfortable your chair has become until I just brought it to your attention. The point is, you're not focused on all of your senses all at the same time, all equally. It's more like juggling. Sensory processing is how the brain sorts through all that sensory input. It juggles sensations, decides what's important, and chooses how to respond to the most important sensory input that it's receiving. When the sensory processing is working well, the brain is aware of all the most important sensations, like your hand being scalded by steam or an urgent need to pee. It can also push aside the annoying, unimportant sensations. The hum of a machine won't derail the brain from focusing on conversation. An itchy tag isn't going to become an emergency. But you guys are here because things don't seem to be working so well. Sometimes senses aren't processed correctly. The vital information goes missing and the obscure details take the spotlight. Here's a silly analogy, and you might be able to guess what TV shows I've been binging lately. Let's think of the brain as the president. The president is the head of the executive branch, and his decisions make things happen. Now there's tons of people clamoring for the president's attention all day long through letters, emails, and face-to-face meetings. But the president obviously can't welcome all these folks into the Oval Office all at the same time. He has to give his attention to one thing at a time. This is where the chief of staff comes into play. She's in charge of who gets in to see the president. It's her job to decide what issues are important and who should jump to the front of the line and whose concerns are not urgent enough to take up the president's time. If sensory processing is working well, it's kind of like two people that want an audience with the president, a CIA agent and a long-winded senator. Let's think of the CIA agent as needed sensory input. The senator is annoying and troubling sensory input. Let's see how a good chief of staff would handle the two types of sensory input. The senator likes to talk the president's ear off about his pet topic, legislation regarding casinos. He could easily take up hours of the president's time, but the chief of staff knows it's a non-essential issue and schedules the senator for a tiny slot of time to air his concerns. She makes sure the senator can't bother the president and sidetrack him from the real pressing matters of leading the country. Life can carry on. Now, the CIA agent, or the important sensory input, receives urgent intel that's a threat to national security. When he comes to the chief of staff, she immediately lets him into the Oval Office, clears the president's schedule, and even introduces the agent to the president with the phrase, "Sir, you're gonna need to hear this." The president's informed of the security risk and is able to mobilize the military to protect the citizens. The pressing danger has been dealt with. Now, let's see how the president would fare with the same two sensory input types, but with an incompetent chief of staff. The CIA agent is desperate to tell the president about the threat to national security, but the chief of staff doesn't have the discernment to realize how needed this information is. She dutifully asks the agent to patiently wait in line. Meanwhile, the president is missing key information he needs to make a decision about a military action. He's forced to go seek it out himself, leaving behind all his other duties and concerns because he really needs this intel to keep the nation safe. What happens when that annoying time hog of a senator wants to discuss his pet project? The chief of staff lets him right into the president without warning. Everyone else has to wait, no matter how urgent and important. The chief of staff doesn't even set a limit on the meeting with the senator, but just lets it drag on and on. The president eventually can't handle it anymore and he loses his cool. Or maybe he decides the best tactic is avoidance and he takes an emergency hiatus to Camp David just to get away from the annoying senator. While the president is busy hiding from the senator, the rest of the country suffers. Whether it's the president having to seek out intelligence that should have been on his desk, or the president needing to avoid pesky senators that the chief of staff should have restricted his access, either way, the president is not where he belongs. He's not able to do his job because his chief of staff, or the sensory processor, isn't doing their job. So instead, the president is spending his time seeking or avoiding. This might be an overly vivid picture of what sensory processing's job is within the brain-body connection, but hopefully it gets the point across. A child with sensory processing struggles either isn't getting the sensory input he truly needs to be able to function, and/or she is being derailed by some troubling sensory input. If you've heard the terms seekers and avoiders, this is where that comes from. Avoiders are hypersensitive to certain sensory input and it can seriously throw that child for a loop. If they encounter that unwelcome sensory input, it can trigger the fight or flight response. Seekers are hyposensitive to certain sensory input. that are actually quite needed for them to function. They need the input, but it's just not registering. The seeker becomes desperate and tries to get that input any way they can. In this lesson, we talked about how sensory parents need knowledge and ongoing support. We learned about the 3 forgotten senses: vestibular, proprioceptive, and interoceptive senses. Then we compared sensory processing to the chief of staff's job as the filter to the president. And finally, we discussed seekers and avoiders and how they respond differently to sensory input. In the next video, we're going to talk about symptoms of sensory processing disorder. How do you know what's normal and how do you know what's just quirky kid stuff? I'll also have a free printable to share with you with some of these symptoms of SPD. I know you don't want to miss it. In the meantime, hop on over to our Facebook group, introduce yourself, and answer the question of the day. Lots of fun conversations are going on over there. I hope you guys have an awesome day. See you soon.